Leningrad Documentary Film Studios, commissioned by the USSR State Television and Radio Broadcasting Committee. The 40th anniversary of victory. The front. They were the first to defend their country, and no one knew then for how many days they would have to march along the roads of war. And there were 1,418 days of war, and by far not all of them saw the end of these days. There is hardly a family in the Soviet Union that had not been seared by the flames of war. Mothers, wives, daughters, and sons still grieve for those they lost. Those days are gone forever, and yet they remain with us forever. War. It started so suddenly for us. But Nazi Germany was preparing for it for quite some time. In just a few years, the armed forces of Hitler Germany increased by more than 30 times. We do not need the right to start and wage a war, Hitler had said cynically. What we need is victory. The fascists dreamed of ruling the world. They occupied Austria and Czechoslovakia. On September 1st, 1939, they attacked Poland. That's how the Second World War started, lasting 6 years and affecting scores of millions of people all over the world. The jackboot of the aggressor trampled the roads of Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Yugoslavia, and Greece. France capitulated. It seemed that no one could stop the fascist hordes. They themselves believed it. But they did not know that ahead of them lay Stalingrad, where they would lose close to 1.5 million of their troops. But all that was yet to come. In the meantime, the German headquarters was preparing a plan for a blitzkrieg onslaught against the Soviet Union, the plan known as Barbarossa. Europe was the arsenal for aggression, its plants and strategic raw materials. 190 divisions were brought up to the Soviet borders. The morning of June 22nd, 1941 seemed peaceful and tranquil. The enemy invaded our country without a declaration of war, treacherously violating all the articles of the Non-Aggression Pact. The force of this unexpected attack was truly devastating. Our losses were very heavy. These guns and tanks were unable to fire a single shot. These planes never took off. Hitler's invading army numbered 5.5 million men, armed with more than 4,000 tanks and close to 5,000 planes. The enemy had 3 to 5 times more men than we did, but the Soviet soldiers heroically defended every inch of their land. On the very first day of the war, the enemy experienced the tenacity of our resistance at Brest on the border. For over a month, the Soviet garrison defended the Brest fortress. There was no food or water. The troops were bombed and shelled, but they did not surrender. At the approaches to Kiev, Leningrad, and Smolensk, the fighting was fierce. The Germans soon realized that they lost too many days in these battles. The Barbarossa blitzkrieg was bogging down. The enemy was frantically forging ahead. He was still stronger. Soviet soldiers died fighting, holding the enemy back for an hour, for 2 hours, for a whole day. And these burning tanks also did all they could. In those bitter days when the Soviet troops were forced to retreat, there were few politicians in the West who believed that the Soviet Union would emerge victorious. But they believed, they knew that they would return to the towns and villages that they had evacuated. Films taken by the enemy. They believed that their new order was justified, their plunder and bloody terror. Their plans were to settle the territory of the USSR up to the Urals with German colonists, liquidating or banishing the local population. Such was their Ostplan. The country was in mortal danger. The Soviet people's response to the invaders was the Great Patriotic War, the People's Sacred War. Millions responded to the Communist Party's appeal to rise up against the enemy. Mobilization was announced, and voluntary units were formed in border areas to aid the standing army. The defenders of Leningrad stopped the enemy forces and did not let them capture the city. For the Hitlerites, the fate of the war depended on the capture of Moscow, the plan codenamed Typhoon. Moscow was preparing to repel the onslaught. The city was ready to fight to the death for every street and every square. The enemy threw its crack troops against Moscow. Vast is the land of Russia, but there is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us, said the defenders of the capital. The fascists considered themselves in Moscow. Some of them were, but much later and under different circumstances. July 8, 1944, 57,000 prisoners captured in Belarusia were paraded down Moscow streets. Red Square in the heart of the capital will never forget November 7, 1941, when the traditional parade was held here, indicating that the government was firmly in control of the situation. From Red Square, the troops marched right to the front. The Soviet Union was gathering its strength for a counteroffensive. The defense of the capital was in the hands of top military leaders. The Western Front was commanded by General of the Army Georgy Zhukov. 3.5 years later, Marshal Zhukov, on behalf of the Soviet government, would accept the unconditional surrender of Hitlerite Germany. December 6, 1941, the Red Army took the first step towards victory. In the outskirts of Moscow, the Soviet troops launched their counteroffensive. "38 German divisions were routed, and fascist Germany suffered its first major defeat in the Second World War. The road of their drive for Moscow became the road of their retreat. The Soviet troops firmly believed this day would come. Hitler's plans for a blitzkrieg were buried in the snow near Moscow, but a large part of the country was still occupied. The Soviet people's struggle did not stop at the front line. The battle continued on occupied territory, giving the enemy no rest. Thousands of guerrilla units fought the enemy and destroyed enemy trains. The heroism of Soviet troops at the front merged with the heroism of those who worked in the rear. The whole country became a fighting camp with but one fighting motto: all for the front, all for victory. In the summer of 1942, with no second front in Europe yet, Hitler regrouped his troops for an offensive in the southern part of the country. He was driving for the rich granary of the Kuban and the oil fields of the Caucasus. But Stalingrad was in the way. The city became a regular battlefield. The enemy broke into the city streets and believed the city was captured. Iron crosses were already being handed out. The fate of the world hung in the balance here on this narrow strip of land. For more than 2 months, there was fierce fighting for every street, every house, every floor. But the enemy was still strong and dangerous. At times, every step meant bloodshed or a life lost. The defenders of Stalingrad were able to hold back the overwhelming enemy forces and win time to prepare a counteroffensive. The counteroffensive started November 19th with the thunder of 7,000 artillery guns and mortars. Four days later, the fascist troops were surrounded by an iron ring, holding more than 22 enemy divisions. The troops sent to their aid were destroyed, and Field Marshal von Paulus was taken prisoner, together with what remained of his troops. Berlin was in mourning, for there was no victory at Stalingrad. The defeat of the enemy forces at Stalingrad signified a radical change in the course of the war. The end was predetermined, but the war continued, taking lives on a huge territory extending from the Barrens to the Black Sea. This was the most terrible of all wars ever experienced by mankind. It was a cruel war, demanding total sacrifice by soldiers in the name of victory. It also demanded difficult, heavy labor in the rear, for there could be no victory without it. Two years of savage fighting had steeled the Soviet soldier, given him fighting experience, taught him to defeat the enemy and handle the new weaponry produced in the rear. But their main weapon was their courage and heroism. An example of mass heroism was the defense of a small strip of land near the city of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea. The story was told in his book Little Land by Leonid Brezhnev, who was then head of the Army Political Department. The communists were at the heart of the defense of Little Land. In 1943 alone, more than 2 million soldiers and officers joined the Communist Party. The village of Prokhorovka. The world heard of this village in the summer of 1943. The greatest battle of tanks of the Second World War took place on this field. These are soldiers for Operation Citadel. They were supposed to take revenge for the defeat at Stalingrad and help the fascist generals change the course of the war. The fascists pinned great hopes on their new tanks and artillery. The Eastern Front continued attracting the Wehrmacht's main forces. On the 5th day of fighting, the German generals believed they could encircle the troops of 2 Soviet fronts. However, the Battle of the Kursk Bulge did not begin as the German generals had planned. Soviet artillery unexpectedly broke up the deployment of enemy forces before they could launch their attack. It seemed that nothing living could stand up to such an avalanche of steel. This was a special type defense line. The main force had dug in for defense in order to bleed the enemy white, and then the reserve forces were thrown in to destroy the enemy. Such were the wise strategic plans of the Soviet High Command. History knows no such battles. On both sides, there were over 4 million men, more than 13,000 tanks, and up to 12,000 planes. It was here, in Prokhorovka village, that the enemy counted on ramming force of its Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands. But once again, Soviet tanks proved to be superior: better armor, better weaponry, better maneuverability, and better crews. More than half the divisions thrown into battle by the enemy were grinded down by Soviet troops in the Battle of the Kursk Bulge. Operation Citadel collapsed, and fascist Germany was now faced with a catastrophe. After this battle, the roles of the warring sides changed. Now the Red Army launched its counteroffensive. On August 5th, there was an artillery salute in Moscow for the liberation of the cities of Oryol and Belgorod. This was the first of many victory salutes. The Soviet troops were now in pursuit of the enemy, and the soldier continued his march over the long-suffering, bleeding land, liberating Soviet people from fascist enslavement. The retreating fascist troops applied the scorched earth policy demanded by their Führer, destroying everything that could be destroyed, for they now knew that they would never return. The Red Army was advancing westwards, and the population of the liberated cities, Kharkov, Kiev, Minsk, Sebastopol, Novorossiysk, and Kishinev, greeted the troops like their own sons. Finally, the enemy was swept out of the country. But now occupied Europe was awaiting its liberation from fascism. Bitter battles, more casualties. The liberation of Poland alone took the lives of 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The Polish flag was again flying over Warsaw. Together with the Soviet forces, the enemy was pursued by Polish, Czechoslovak, Bulgarian, and Romanian troops, and the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia. They saved Europe from the fascist plague. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Dachau, Mauthausen. In these and hundreds of other death camps, the Hitlerites murdered 11 million inmates. This is what the Soviet soldiers saved Europe from. Hitler and his clique tried to postpone the day of their collapse. They gave guns even to 16-year-old boys, trying to make all Germans fight for the regime. And although the Second Front was opened in Europe almost a year before, the fascist command continued claiming that the fate of the war was being decided on the Eastern Front and not the Western Front. The battle for Berlin was about to start. The guns and machines made in the Urals and in Siberia were to pave the way to victory for the Soviet troops. One more letter home before the battle. The battle is about to begin. The soldier is about to attack. He will bring the Soviet banner to Berlin, from where the war came to us, and that banner will be hoisted over the Reichstag. The last salute of the war will be fired in Moscow, and the soldier in parade uniform will march along Red Square, throwing the fascist banners at the foot of the Lenin Mausoleum. At home, everyone was waiting for the soldier to return. The whole country was awaiting the victorious soldier. And he returned. But the road leading to this day was a difficult one. How many of his friends and comrades remained on the fields of battle? We lost more than 20 million people in that war. Peace is cherished all the more when it is won at such a high price. Script Mikhail Yudiev, direction Viktor Semenyuk, camera Lev Rozhin. Materials were used in this film from the USSR State Film Archives and the Central State Film and Photo Archives.